So this is the second time, if not the third time in the last couple of weeks I've had the same problem. Challenge or opportunity, depending on how you see it, which is to place second to somebody of the calibre and entertainment of Mervyn. So I had that a couple of weeks ago as well, where one did feel that one absolutely had to now follow that experience. But actually, I really believe in, and Mervyn and I have just had a little conversation, that although I'm coming at this from a completely different angle, actually I'm not. I'm coming at this from the angle about how do we not only provide great care and support, but how do we give people great lives? And the how do we give people great lives question for me is as much for the staff and the people working in the services as it is for the service users, clients, patients themselves. And certainly what I'll share with you a bit later is what we absolutely know from inspection is that the organisations that we are rating as outstanding are outstanding because that's what they've got. That's what they understand, that's what they're able to do, and a little bit about what some of those characteristics are. As well as being responsible for general practice dentistry out of hours and 111 inspections in London, I'm here today because I take a national lead. So I'm the national lead for safeguarding for the Care Quality Commission. If it's okay, I'm a nurse, not a social worker. That's my other problem. I'm a nurse, but and I went into nursing in 1982, so not quite as long as Mervyn, but catching up fast. But like Mervyn, I have never regretted it for a day, except for that time I went to the DH on secondment for a year, which is probably a fairly similar experience. And I still work clinically. I still inflict myself on the poor patients of a general practice in Buckinghamshire on a fairly regular basis with respiratory conditions of various sorts. But I also have responsibility for all of our children's inspection work, particularly our joint inspections with Ofsted of Children Looked After Services. But what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about today, because it's about how I think we might challenge some of this conversation, is the work that I do in the health and justice system. Because I think that conversation about prisoners, human rights, civil society, and the impact or not of the Care Act in that space, I hope will fit with today's discussion. So is that all right? Anybody want to leave now? That's the other thing I've often had is people who've come to the wrong lecture and thought they were coming to something about pressure ulcers or something and rush out the door at this moment. Okay, so I'm going to flick through these really quickly. You all know who we are? How many of you have experienced an inspection from us? How hard am I going to have to be the acceptable face of regulation? That's why I always wear a really nice jacket and stuff. So that at least I can tweet nicely. You know what we do, but I particularly want to talk to you about some of the stuff in inspection, and I particularly want to talk to you about some of the stuff in independent voice, because I think, again, it goes back to Mervyn's principles discussion. Actually, having independent voice is probably one of the most powerful things that we have, but the authority to use that independent voice, and whether for good or ill, if Andrea was standing here, which would be much better for you all, but if Andrea was standing here, you know, we do believe that the State of Care report last year and what we said about the state of social care, I completely get Mervyn's space about the talking up the crisis bit, but it did contribute to a set of to a set of conversations. But that's because it was based on really strong evidence. It wasn't just anecdote. It wasn't just one story. It was having done thousands and thousands and thousands of inspections and talked with thousands and thousands of service users and their families. We are in a changing environment, and again, there's lots of stuff going on for us right across the country at the moment. Lots of new models, whether it's new models in general practice, again, general practice coming together to create bigger cooperatives, whether it's what's going on in the social care sector, or whether it's what's going on nationally. So we are involved in a set of 20 local system reviews, which again will highlight, I think, a number of issues about what Mervyn talked about what might be the necessary conditions for some of these different models, which are going into 20 systems in local authority, health, the whole provision system, mostly focused around, oh God, I can't tell you how depressed. Ministers insisted that it was focused on delayed transfers of care, because of course that's the most important thing that we've got in the system at the moment, but their driver was around the 2 billion winter delayed transfers of care. The conversations are, of course, about what's happening with the leadership, what's going on with the relationships, what's getting in the way of the sort of cooperation and collaboration that's going on in those sectors. And as we start to publish those reports, I think that they will start to throw up some of the very questions that Mervyn's been posing and that the CQC poses, which is about who is in charge of defining what great care and great support needs to look like, and how do we engage the wider society, because this is this seminar is about the relationship with civil societies as well as the Care Act. This bit about we are going to have to come together as a country to have some of these conversations, and the microcosm of what's going on in some of these local systems. So part of what we look at in our inspections is against those 5 key questions, as you know, which is safe, effective, caring, responsive and well-led, is safeguarding. Lots of issues for me, I think, about the wide definition of that and the narrow definition of that. I think at the moment in quite a lot of our inspections, it probably feels like we're at the fairly narrow definition. It's sort of sitting in safe. It's not really sitting in responsive. It's certainly not sitting in effective. And if some of the things for Mervyn around how do we make that personal, how do we assess with you what great outcomes look like for people from a system that is actually enabling them to live their best lives and make better choices? And how is it that we are going to do that? But it is absolutely fundamental, because if we're not enabling people to live free from harm, abuse and neglect, then sort of we need to get up and go home. And what's the role that we play? So we do, and slightly unashamedly, focus on some of the conversations about how providers have effective systems and processes. Really important for us, not only how do we use data to assess our perception of your risk, but what do you use to assess your perception, not only of the risk within the services, but more importantly, the risks with individuals, and how it is that those get managed and mitigated. Making sure that people do take the right sorts of action, and raising safeguarding issues across the system, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Holding providers to account and publishing our findings. And I just thought I'd take an opportunity to share a few of these findings with you. So if I take mental health services, over 70% of mental health services we've rated as good and outstanding. But in those that we haven't, even in those that we've rated as good, the domain in which they are most likely not to be rated as good is in safe. It's not just about safeguarding, but actually it's about that broader definition of those whole set of issues that helps it is to keep people safe. We recently published our end of programme report about mental health services, and we are really worried about a number of things, but 2 or 3 things in particular in this domain. We're concerned about the number of people who are locked in rehabilitation wards. What does that say about, and it's for a whole load of reasons about staffing. I'm not minimising what the reasons are, and what we have found in terms of the variation of use of restraint and restrictive practices. Some real stuff, I think, at the core of what it is that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about some of these issues around safeguarding. In acute hospitals, again, most of the issues in relation to SAFE do relate to technical aspects in relation to care. So there's quite a lot of stuff about, are there drug administration processes safe, or is the patient getting the right leg chopped off rather than the left leg chopped off, or whichever one it was meant to be. But actually, again, how we see some of that in a wide or narrow context around safeguarding, I think, is something that we need to continue to debate, and that we are continuing to think about in terms of the work it is that we do. So we get a lot of incidents reported to us, and you will see that from the adult social care sector in any given year, we get 46,000 safeguarding incidents. So I think the first couple of questions for me is that huge degree of variation. Now clearly, in adult social care, the majority of those are coming out of institutional settings. But we've got to think that there's quite a lot of underreporting. And look at what's going on in primary medical services. Almost nothing is coming out of general practice. Does everybody in the country, almost, are they registered with a GP? Yeah. Does every care home have GPs going in and out of them every day? Or not every day, but they tell me every day. So how come I've got all this stuff going on in sectors in which GPs go in and look and see and are part of the care team, and whose they would call them patients, but whose patients they are as service users, and yet that's what's coming out of primary medical services? Do we even think...
It's the source of the referral that...
Yeah.
The key at the bottom.
Yes, yeah. So the key at the bottom...
It's not necessarily where it took place, it's the source of the referral.
And the regulations are, if you are carrying out your regulated activity in the care home, it's still... I mean, the care home should report it too, so we should have duplication, but in terms of that bit of the territory. So to what extent does that make us think that we've really got a shared team responsibility? Going back to almost your discussion about ownership in that bit of the conversation. Again, in terms of the conversations in hospitals. But the other thing we wonder a little bit is whether always there are those skills around discrimination. So it's a really interesting conversation that we have a lot. So when is a safeguarding incident really a poor care incident, which is really a regulatory incident? Does that distinction exist? Is it both and? What does that mean about what we should think about doing with some of these incidents? The other interesting discussion is what the different sorts of, if you then break out against the categories of abuse, is just how big, again, the variation is. So in mental health, for example, 60% of those incidents will relate to physical abuse. 18% to neglect, 22% to physical and emotional harm, 9% to sexual abuse concerns, and 4% around financial and money type issues. In adult social care, it's 38% neglect, 40% physical abuse, 12% emotional harm, and 4% sexual.
Sorry, is that neglect as in poor care? Or just others? What's the definition?
So those are the incidents that have been reported to us, and they will be a mixture of people reporting out of perhaps domiciliary care about broader issues of neglect, but they are mostly about where a service user, a carer, or somebody else in the service is reporting that they think that the care that's being delivered or not being delivered constitutes neglect.
So it's poor care.
It's poor care.
Yeah.
And in the really interesting fact, in hospitals, it's 67% neglect. Now, that doesn't mean, so that's what they are as they come in as being reported, but I think it is really interesting, both as a discussion about awareness, definitions, what's happening in the different sectors about what it is that people see, and don't forget, if I'm a service user, I might be crossing most of these sectors. If I'm an older person with dementia, just to take an example, our mental health services seeing my issues very differently from how social care services are seeing my issues, which is differently from my GP who's probably not seeing them at all. And where does all of that come together as the story that is me? The other then interesting thing is, so what do we do with all of this? Let's go past that. So what do we do with all of this? So clearly we have a number of actions that we might choose or be able to take. When we analyse them, about 7% of them we refer urgently to the local authority safeguarding teams. We make urgent safeguarding referrals. About 20% of the time we have contact with the provider. So we sort of say we don't quite know, often you don't get quite enough information, we would have a conversation with a provider. 88, these percentages don't add up to 100 because sometimes we do more than one thing, just in case somebody thinks my maths is incredibly poor, because it is, but it's not that poor. 88% of the time it becomes part of the data and information sheet that we use for planning a future inspection, put together with so that whole pattern of what do we think's going on in that provider. And in about 12% of the time, we then also take some form of more immediate enforcement action. So we may have what we call a management review meeting where we would bring together the local inspector, perhaps an expert specialist advisor, and say, have we reached a threshold here that might require immediate action, which could include going in and doing a full comprehensive inspection, going and doing a responsive visit to look at particularly some aspect of care. So let's say it was an issue of restraint. We might go in and look at what's going on in that environment in terms of their practices with respect to restraint. We might participate, perhaps potentially following a local authority referral with a local strategy meeting, and we might choose to take enforcement action. The level of safeguarding referrals made to us has increased hugely by about 20... It's increasing about 20% a year. And it does seem to be most commonly increasing in the areas that are related to neglect. And we think that that is a sign of some of the issues of the strain in the system. So those correlations between staffing levels, reduced frequency of visits, very short visits perhaps in the domiciliary care setting, all that, those senses are, and again, that interesting discussion about consequences neglect, but it's really hard to describe it in a sense as a deliberate, neglectful safeguarding event. It's that bit about the wider context And I'd be interested when we get to the questions, in your view, about, in your experience, do we have that balance right? I was talking to somebody before I came up, and that big conversation about, I know sometimes how people feel about how they see our role as the regulator, and whether they think that at the moment we are doing enough as the regulator to signal and to enable what we want as good care and great care. Because I think sometimes there's a view that the regulations, because they seem to focus on systems and processes, don't enable organisations to think that they can and should be taking risks around how to deliver personalised care to the individual. Clearly, the first bit of our view would be to say our experience is that the organisations that have really good systems and processes, including training and processes for taking those decisions, take those decisions better and make better decisions. That they're the building block, and if they're not there, and people say, well, we don't have them because we have a completely person-centred approach, often when you test that isn't really quite what's in place. But at the same time, if it is ever your lived experience that you really are thinking that you're sitting in a room with a client or a service user saying, I'd love to do this, but the CQC won't let us, ring me up. Ring me then and there from the meeting, because I need to understand that, we need to understand that, because that's clearly something that we need to understand if we're having that consequence. This is about, we want to be in the space that is about having the assessment tools that enable you to be confident enough to make difficult or risky or empowering decisions with your clients and service users from the confidence of knowing that you've got the systems and processes in place to do those things well. But if anybody ever says we can't do it because of the CQC, you'll have my contact details, won't they, on the list. Ring me up, because we've clearly gone just a little bit awry at that moment. The thing that I did say that I wanted to talk about, given the tone of this meeting, is the work that we do in prisons and all other approved premises. And again, some of you will see, how many of you watched the Panorama programme a couple of weeks ago about Brook House? So we have, we inspect prisons, immigration referral centres, just starting to inspect secure children's homes. Isn't it appalling that nobody's been inspecting secure children's homes up to now, but there we are. Youth offending institutions, and all of the elements of the secure estate. We do it in partnership with Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons. And it's an interesting relationship because Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons is a inspectorate, not a regulator. So we are an independent regulator with statutory powers. They are an inspectorate and they're the lead agency. So it's taken us a little while to work out how to do that shimmy shuffle into the right place. But it's been really interesting. There's been a new Chief Inspector of Prisons, and I met him when he'd done his first visit to Feltham Young Offender Centre. And if you're aware, Feltham Young Offender Centre in South London. Really challenging place to work, never mind to be detained. Very famous or infamous a few years ago for a couple of race-related or believed to be race-related homicides, horrific suicide and parasuicide rate. And Peter came and he said, Ursula said, I need to ask you something. The boys all looked so ill. Given, because for those of you that don't know, Peter is a long-standing policeman who used to run part of the anti-terrorism squad. So he's not soft as our Peter. And he said, I was so worried about them. He said, they all looked so ill. And we had a conversation about locked up 23 hours a day, often, as you will know very well, come from backgrounds and circumstances that will have made them vulnerable in the first place. Because they're locked up for so long, they no longer get released for breakfast. So 17-year-old boys, young men I should say, God, if I called my nephew a boy, I'd be in deep trouble. They're 17-year-old young men who at 8 o'clock in the evening get given a small brown paper bag in which there is one of those, you know those mini boxes of cereal that my brothers and I used to fight over? Because you remember, the cornflakes would always be left because they'd have pinched the sugar puffs first. And a little carton of milk and perhaps a piece of fruit or a little yoghurt. How many 17-year-olds do you know who you could give that to at 8 o'clock at night and it would still be available for them to eat at breakfast in the morning? My nephew's eaten most of the fridge by 9:45. So we had a conversation about, so it's no wonder that they can't engage with education. It's no wonder that they're depressed. It's no wonder that they become aggressive. They're just bloody, I mean, they're hungry, they're locked up. But if I went out and had that conversation with the editor of the Daily Mail, am I going to have a safeguarding conversation with the editor of the Daily Mail? Am I going to have a safeguarding conversation with most of the people on Hounslow High Street? So our work is really, really challenging in this arena. It's really challenging for our inspectors. Again, you know, you see what's happening in prisons. There has been a 35% increase in resignations of psychologists in mental health services working in prisons. Not because the work is difficult and challenging, not because they feel they're vulnerable to being attacked, but because actually they can't get to see their clients because there's nobody to take the clients to their appointments. And they're saying, I can't do my job. And our suicide rate's going up like this, and our spice use is going up like that. But to what extent should we be using the Care Act, the language of safeguarding, in the context of people? I mean, I know what we're going to say, but how do you do that in the context? And particularly, because as many of you will know, there is a fundamental problem with the Care Act. And the problem with the Care Act is that the local authority powers do not apply if you are detained in prison or residing in an approved premises. We estimate at the moment that there are 2,000 prisoners with dementia in the prison estate at the moment. We have an ageing prison population. We had a conversation just before I came up about what might it be like to really not really remember why you're in prison. Should I tell you, I mean clinically, should I tell you every day what you did if you don't quite remember? What are the ethics of that bit of the population? We've finally got the Ministry of Justice to set up a specialist working group to look at the care and management of, but in particular the challenge of their access to social care. And if there is a safeguarding incident, it is managed by the governor, and the governor does not have to report it outside the prison. And health and social care providers for prisoners can no longer rely on support from local safeguarding teams. And there's an absence of independent scrutiny except what we might find on our inspection. But that's not the same as the sort of scrutiny and oversight that somebody outside would have if they were subject to the sorts of safeguarding incidents. I mean, let's be clear, rape. When is rape not a safeguarding incident? So a really interesting And we can't require prisons to investigate our concerns or share the outcome of their investigation with us. So there's a complete, of a group of people that we know are vulnerable. We know how many people in prisons have learning disabilities, both pre-incarceration as well as post-incarceration, significant mental health issues. And they're in an extremely vulnerable and difficult environment. And yet, society, we don't afford them these sorts of protections. And it does make, certainly for the clinicians working in that area, and for our inspectors, it does make for a really challenging situation. So, I've just lost my right bit of paper. The other thing that I just wanted to talk a little bit about, because it will come up this afternoon, is the conversation about whistleblowing. Because clearly the other place where we get information is via whistleblowing. The CQC now hosts what's called the National Guardian's Office. And as you will know, there are systems and infrastructures operating right across the public sector, and you'll get an expert discussion about that tomorrow after, this afternoon. And again, just to give you some numbers, on average, we receive between 600 and 700 whistleblowing inquiries a month, of which between 500 and 600 of those are from adult social care. About 100 of them are from hospitals, and about 3 are from GP primary medical services again, and a couple of them are unspecified. We treat, clearly there are 2 or 3 things that we do with whistleblowing inquiries. Sometimes they're quite difficult to investigate because they're often quite vague, and often for that very understandable reason, we struggle to know what to do with them. But in adult social care, in the year ending April 17, the vast majority, so we referred 800 of 3,200 to another body. So we thought there was sufficient grounds for that, often to another regulatory body. So for example, we might have got a whistleblowing incident if it's about the practice of an individual professional, as opposed to the provider in which they work. So we do a lot of liaison with other professional bodies. We include them in our process of planned review, and we link them into that data. So if I was getting whistleblowing alerts, if I was getting whistleblowing concerns and things coming through in our alerts and concerns process about an institution, we would knit all of that together to say there's a lot of noise in that bit of the world at the moment. What is it that I should do about them? But the other thing that we do that I think is really important in this space is that we assess individual organisations' openness and transparency around the whistleblowing issue. What's the infrastructure that they have in place? How do they deal with their own whistleblowers? Or more importantly, how do they not need whistleblowing? Because actually, as we talked about, the way in which staff work with management, the visibility of management, means that people are really clear about what it is that they can bring up those concerns, and those concerns won't be addressed. Because at the end of the day, whistleblowing is a failure. The need to whistleblow is a failure of certainly if you're working within an organisation, it can be seen as a failure of that organisation to respond if you have been legitimately raising concerns for some time. What we found is in terms of our reports is that those organisations that do really well, as I said a while ago, in relation to how they manage their safeguarding and how they manage everything else have a really common set of themes around them that we've identified and we've published and work on. You would certainly see it in Angria's end-of-year care report, which are about those characteristics of leadership that are critical, we think, in this space. First and foremost is that conversation about values. What are the values of your organisation as a provider? Your values. How do you demonstrate those? And how is that leadership cascaded right down and through the organisation? How visible are you as a leader? Certainly when we go to big organisations, big trusts, really telling conversation is when the different, again, outstanding organisations are, it's open. When we went to Newcastle, to the huge big trust in Newcastle, everybody knew who the chief executive was. He had a huge visibility and profile, as did other members of the board and the non-executives. In a small care home, some of that stuff, as Andrew said, can be easy because it's a small single team, but perhaps if you're part of if an organisation is part of a Bupa group, and certainly for us in general practice, really worrying when there's a sort of distant head office. Things go up to head office or instructions come down from head office, but head office are never seen. The most important bits for us is that these organisations have a culture that is about improving. Whatever it is that they're concerned about, they have a culture that is always about saying, it's a really hard balance to get, isn't it, between congratulating people for doing a really great job, but never quite being 100% satisfied. So we're really great. We do really great things for our service users. Got some really great examples, but we can still get a little bit better. There's still a little bit more than that we can do. They're always open organisations. They're the organisations that invite people in to visit. They're the organisations that go out and visit other people. They're the organisation that don't have all their training done in-house, but go out and come to events like this. Almost by definition, people who are in training events like this don't need to be there, but actually the fundamental bit is that not only have they sought training, but they've come out to be trained with others and are really open. You can take an idea back, and what you won't get is, oh, well, we don't do that here. Or, oh, well, we tried that 27 years ago when Florence was around, it didn't work. That isn't what you hear in those sorts of organisations, and they are always incredibly person-centred. It's really difficult for us sometimes because as an inspector around issues like expectations, and again, I'd be interested in your perspective. So often we find organisations who perhaps have set up a charity and raise money perhaps to be able to do extra things for their service users or for their patients. And we always have debates, or they've run a marathon, or people have done things. We'd be really interested in your perspective about where we should sit in terms of assessing that as an expectation. Is it it's fantastic that the staff are passionate enough to want to do that. But if I tried to indicate that in order to be an outstanding service provider, really people have to be giving at an incredible level, partly to plug some gaps in the system anyway, but also to give people rewards. But we do just get some fantastic and fabulous stories. There were great stories from adult social care. There were amazing stories from my sector, practice in Leeds that worked particularly with homeless people. They had a man with them who was very close to death. And he said, do you know, he said, I've never seen the sea. Next day, they took him to the sea. And he died the day after. That's, I think, the thing always to remember is we've got the social care crisis as perceived, but actually day in, day out, we are doing fantastic things with service users. We are keeping many service users safe, not only safe, but helping them to live better lives. And I think the other thing for us at CQC is it's as much our job to publicise and celebrate that success, to make sure that you get those recognition and rewards for doing that great job, while also being the place that does put the hand up when things aren't quite at the point it is that we need them to be. So for us, I think, in summary, safeguarding in its broadest sense, in that whole principles within the Care Act definition, is at the heart of what it is that we're trying to measure. We are going to, and assess, we are going to, in our next stage of the methodology, really try to move into a sense of looking at outcomes, building on your systems and processes. We've been round once, we know where you all are with systems and processes, but really try to think about how it is that we might move that into to the outcome space, the better lives, different outcomes for somebody because of the way that you've thought about, worked with them, worked on what their choices would be and worked to enable those choices, or a possible version of that to be able to happen. We're absolutely clear that in those best services, what staff say about working for the organisation is as important as what patients say about being cared for, or service users say about receiving care from the organisation. And I do think that chimes, Mervyn, with the stuff that you were saying. You know, whether it ends up in something that's called the cooperative movement or a social enterprise, in those organisations that work, that set of values that are both in the Care Act and in the underpinning principles of things like the cooperative movement and social enterprise, around people coming together to cooperate and collaborate, and a really interesting conversation about where the power sits in those relationships, we think we find as key in terms of it is at the work we can do. But there are areas where there are still fundamental problems and fundamental challenges with how society views the deserving and the undeserving, to take your view. And I hope that I, in the conversation about prisons, maybe told you something that you weren't quite aware of in terms of that population, but also what it still is to be in one of those pockets that society in its wider sense places in that undeserving box, and how we as a community of people who are passionate about this area might think about how we might work together to be able to highlight some of those issues and to improve the life chances for a group of people who I think deserve to have some greater opportunities. Thank you very much.